Welcome to the Thursday edition of the Chiefs, and of course, with us again tonight are Ana Marie Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, Lucy Cruz Valdez, the head of News 5, and coming online in a few minutes will be Robbie Alampay of One News. Ladies, good evening.
Good evening.
Hi. Well, we have a guest who's been waiting. I think we should get straight to discussion.
Sige. Akala ko magsisegue pa si Ami. Sige, let's bring him in na. Si Senator Bato Dela Rosa joins us tonight. Senator Bato, thank you po for joining us tonight.
Maraming salamat rin, Ed, for inviting me.
Good evening.
Good evening, Ami. Good evening,
Good evening. Yes.
Senator Bato, kung gusto niyo mag-segue kay mamaya sa wag po kasi nanonood mo kayo ng wag po eh.
Tapos ako the other night.
Si Senator Bato nanonood ng wag po kasi mas kilala pa niya si Jeron kaysa kami. Anyway, I'll get down to the point, Senator. Ano po muna, siguro mahalaga muna makuha yung inyong perspektiba dahil una-una kayo po yung unang PNP chief na naglungsad ng drug war ng Pangulong Duterte noong 2016. At ngayon po kayo po yung committee chairman ng Senado sa Public Order and Dangerous Drugs. So, perspektiba po ninyo muna. Saan na po tayo ngayon sa drug war? After 4 years, are we winning it? Are we not? And what lessons, how would you have done it after 4 years of retrospective?
Well, if I have my way na balikan yung pag-launch ng war on drugs, I will still use the same, yung aking uplantukang. At nakita ko naman na efektibo siya. And siguro kung sasabi mo saan na tayo ngayon, mahirap kung ako ang tanungin mo dahil baka sabihin mong bias ako dahil ako nag-implement ng war on drugs. But magtanong tayo doon sa taong bayan, doon sa baba, kung ano sabihin na sa'yo.
Pero po in retrospect po, wala po kayong ititweak in retrospect. Wala kayong babaguhin, wala kayong i-amyenda doon sa sistema in retrospect?
Sinabi ko nito noon na yung pag-launch ng war on drugs, dapat unahin muna yung mag-internal cleansing mula sa police. Huwag isama yung mga pulis na may record sa drugs doon sa operasyon ng ating mga anti-drug operations. Dahil yun nga, nasingitan tayo noon ng mga tiwaling pulis at ito naman ay nananagot naman yung mga pulis na nahuli na nag-abuso. So, para maiwasan yung abuso na yan, siguruhin na yung pulis na involved sa anti-drug operations ay walang bahid ng droga. At ginagawa naman ng PNP ngayon, since during my leadership, siniguro natin yung maging membro ng anti-drug units ay walang katiwalian na involvement sa drugs. At continuous yan. Hindi yan po pwedeng you will stop to that dahil alam natin itong drug business is very tempting talaga yan. Siguro pagpasok mo ngayon dyan, malinis ka, pagdating mo doon sa loob, nakita mo yung opportunities, nasilaw ka, pwede ka magbago. So dapat continuous ang internal cleansing ng ating PNP.
So nasan po ngayon yan, Senator? Nasan po ngayon yung internal cleansing? Kasi simula naman kasabay lagi yan ng kahit anong peace and order campaign eh. And you're the head of the committee na in charge din sa ganyan. Meron sakop din nyo yan. Sa ngayon po ba, nag-improve ba yung sitwasyon sa PNP? Mas marami na bang nalinis ngayon o nandun pa rin yung risk na marami pa rin katiwalian sa mga pulis natin?
As I have said, continuous yung internal cleansing na ginagawa ng PNP. Hindi sila pwedeng i-stop dyan. Sabihin natin ngayon, merong pulis na nahuli, merong pulis na nakasuhan, merong pulis na natanggal, pero hindi tayo i-stop dyan. Ang data nasa PNP naman kung gaano kadami ng pulis na natanggal dahil sa katiwalian, lalong-lalo na sa involvement sa illegal na droga. Hindi dapat sila hinto. Tuloy-tuloy yan.
Senator, alam niyo, mulat sa poll, ang naging campaign promise ay gawing drug-free nga ang bayan, ano? Pero habang umuusad ang panunungkulan ni Pangulong Duterte, ay tila nabago hanggang sa ngayon, 4 years into his presidency, no? Or 5 years actually, Sir, hanggang ngayon galit pa rin siya sa droga dahil siya mismo ang nagsasabi parang walang tigil, no? Ang mga drug smuggling and drug trading. So, paano nyo bibigyan ng grado yung kampanya ngayon na more than halfway through na ang war on drugs ng gobyerno? Bagsak ho ba? Dahil parang yun at yun din, no? Bumabalik sa kill them, no?
Well, I'll give them a passing grade. Passing grade pa rin. Hindi ko masasabing bagsak. Dahil malaki po ang pinagbabago sa ating sitwasyon ngayon. Pumunta ka sa mga Islam area. Ako, ilang beses ko pumunta, kahit ngayon senador na ako. Marami pa rin nagsasabi sa akin na ordinaryong tao, nagsasabi na, Sir, maraming salamat sa sinimulan mong war on drugs. Dahil ibang-iba na talaga sitwasyon kayo, Sir, kumpara noon. At yung sinasabi mo na milyon-milyon pa rin pumapasok. Well, we must be satisfied sa fact na malalaman natin ngayon na before Duterte, ito nga, panahon ni Duterte administration, ang droga nakakapasok sa atin dito sa ating bansa ay ito yung mga imported galing sa China, galing sa ibang bansa. Pero noon, before Duterte administration, ang droga ay dito mismo ginagawa sa ating bansa. Dito, ang daming malalaking shabu laboratory na giniba natin pagpasok natin. So, yun lang na comparison. Dapat magkakaroon natin tayo ng certain degree of satisfaction. At saka yung pagbaba ng crime rate, yung mga nag-surrender, mga nahuli, napakalaki po ang accomplishment na achieve natin. Kasi kung sabihin mo talaga na walang nangyari, well, that's a very frustrating na sabihin mo walang nangyari. Napakalaki ang nangyari. Pero kung sabihin mo totally mawala ang droga, no less than the president, inadmit niya na campaign promise niya yan. Pero ngayon, hindi niya kinaya dahil iba pala pagdating dito sa national level. Davao, kayang-kaya niya kontrolin dahil nga ang mga tao doon over the course of time na hinawakan niya yung syudad ng Davao, the people learn to accept his brand of leadership at na-feel ng mga tao sa Davao kung ano ang benefits na natanggap ng mga tao dahil sa ganung klaseng pagpamalakad ng gobyerno. Yung trust na earned niya dahil sa haba ng panahon nawakan niya. Dito sa national level, hindi kakayanin yung 6 years. Ang titigas ng tao, lalo na dito sa Metro Manila. Patay ka dito kahit anong gawin mo. Mahirapan ka talaga. Kaya
nga po, Senator, ang sinasabi, hindi ba babaguhin ang approach? Gayong hindi nga maresolba, no? Pero hanggang ngayon, parang killing pa rin. Killing of the drug suspects pa rin ang atake. Hindi ba pwedeng ibang pamamaraan na hindi nga naman nakakalabag sa karapatang pantao? Yan po nang yan ang ito, di ba?
Well, tell me, yung killing na ito, kung paglabag ng karapatang pantao, meron man tayong hustisya, meron namang, pwede ka mag-file ng kaso kung talagang nalabag ang karapatang tao ng mga namatay. Pero tingnan natin, investigahan natin case by case. Tingnan natin, huwag natin ilamsam. Kasi tayo masyado tayong nakikinig dyan sa mga yan, ay kagagawa na naman ng pulis. Mahirap po yun. Isa-isahin natin yan. Kung sabihin mo na magbago tayo na estratehiya, ikaw mismo, matagal mo nang nakita ito nangyari sa atin, bigyan mo ako ng estratehiya na gusto mo at sundin natin kung bagay epektibo ba yan. Kaya ngayon, sabi ko sa inyo, hanggat wala tayong death penalty para dyan sa mga drug traffickers na yan, walang mangyari sa ating war on drugs. Tatawanan at tawanan, sabihan ka lang ng mga Chinese drug lord yan, walang mangyari sa inyo dyan dahil kahit nasa loob kami ng bilibid, enjoying kami, kayang-kaya namin kontrolin yung drug business sa labas. Dahil buhay kami. Pero kung binitay na natin yung mga inchik na yan noon, sino pang magpapasok ng droga dito? Sino magpapadistribute? Wala na. Sila nagkukontrol eh. Yung drug cartel, andyan sa loob ng bilibid, sila nagkukontrol sa drug business sa labas. Kaya dapat
General,
na tayo.
General, marami po tayong tanong later about the death penalty and how it relates to the war on drugs. Pero gusto ko lang pong may follow-up lang po ako tanong doon sa, with regards to, sabi nyo nga po, kung merong human rights violations, pwede naman mag-file ng case. Then in our conversation before, binanggit nyo nga po and you highlighted, and this much is true. Example nyo nga, si Kian de los Santos, yung 3 pulis naman na pumatay, nakasuhan, convicted, and so on. But on the other side of it, ang isa pong tanong ng mga tao, yes, but we're racking our brains trying to think of any other case. In fact, in the complaint to the UN Human Rights Body, yan yung isang hina-highlight ng mga human rights advocates na beyond Kian, we have no other proof that there is accountability. We have no other proof that this government is able to go after suspected human rights violations by police. Kasi nag-iisang kaso lang yung kay Kian na kung saan merong na-convict. What else can we cite to prove your point na hindi, may accountability pa rin ng mga police even when it comes to supposed EJ case?
Kukuha tayo sa IAS ng data para masatisfy ka. Pakita natin sa'yo kung ilan yung police na kinasuhan, ilan yung na-dismiss. Kasi yun lang ang nakikita mo, yung highlighted yung kay Kian de los Santos. Titingnan natin sa magkuha din ng data sa IAS kung ilan ang na-dismiss, ilan ang nakakulong ngayon. Maraming pulis ang nananagot na. Marami na. Pero I cannot give you the data right now. Hingi tayo sa IAS.
Pero Senator, maganda po yung punto nyo kanina na maganda sana kung inuna muna yung internal cleansing para malinis ang ranks bago mag-total drug war. But you might also use that same argument na kailangan muna ng matinding internal cleansing bago i-impose ang death penalty. Kasi kung hindi na nalinis na maigi rin yung ranks, mahirap din na iasa sa unclean ranks na in the end magre-result sa death penalty ng ibang tao.
Kaya nga ngayon, ongoing yung kanilang internal cleansing ng PNP. Ongoing yung kanilang internal cleansing. Yung atin namang batas na gustong ipapasa, yung bill natin ay death penalty for big time drug traffickers. Wala naman siguro sabihin mo na mabibitay dyan yung mga mahirap lang dahil kawawa, walang panggastos, depensa sarili nila doon sa kaso nila. Hindi po yan mangyayari dahil wala namang big time drug lords na wala namang drug trafficker na hindi big time na drug lords. May kaya yan, kaya nga nilang bumili ng pulis, kaya nga lang bumili ng piskal, kaya nga lang magbayad sa mga judge. Yun pang abogado lang, kaya lang magdepensa.
Pero Senator, marami nagsasabi na wala naman daw nahuhuling big time na drug trafficker, no? Ang mga nahuhulik na papatay, yung mga ordinaryong pusher, user, mga mahihirap rin naman, mga small time.
Yung kasi in-insist nila dahil sila ay masama sabihin pero ignorante sila sa struktura ng drug syndicate ng Pilipinas. Kahit anong bansa. Ang struktura ay ganyan yan, no? Pyramidal in shape na sa dulo ng pyramid, nandoon yung mga drug lord, kukunti lang yun. Sa base ng pyramid, andoon yung mga drug pusher. So when you wage a war on drugs, hindi pwedeng selective ka. Kailangan ratsada lahat. Hindi ka pwedeng magsabi na, mamaya niyang mahirap, unahin natin mayaman. Mamaya niyang mayaman, unahin ng mahirap. Hindi. Simultaneous yan. Kaya natural lang na maraming namamatay, maraming nahuli, nakakulong na mga drug pusher doon sa baba. Ang drug lord ko kunti lang, pero kung sabihin mo na walang drug lord, you are totally incorrect pag sinabi mo. Punta ka sa Bilibid, ang daming drug lord doon na nakakulong, punta ka sa Building 14, maraming drug lord doon.
Senator, habang walang death penalty, kasi marami namang tao kahit sinong tanungin nyo, if you ask them, suportahan nyo ba yung war on drugs? Siyempre lahat naman ng tao gusto lipulin niyang problema yan. Pero are you saying, habang walang drug penalty, kaya ba natin gawin yun na mabawasan yung violence? Kasi yun lang naman ang criticism yung methodology na sobra daw violente, sobrang daming namamatay. Are you saying inevitable na magkakamatayan dyan, considering the situation in the country? Meaning, tuloy-tuloy pa rin ba yung style ng paglaban natin sa droga.
Well, pwede mo yang sabihin sa hanay ng government forces. Pero hindi mo yan pwedeng sabihin sa hanay ng mga puser, sa hanay ng mga drug lord na willing makipagpatayan sa pulis. Pwede mo sabihin sa gobyerno, kontrolin natin yan. Pero may limit lang din yan. Hindi yan po pwedeng forever yan, magkukover lang ang pulis pag binabaril lang ng drug puser. Alam mo ba kung ilan ang pulis natin na namatay sa war on drugs? Ang dami ha. Ang dami pulis natin namatay, nasugatan.
So sinasabi niyo
Hindi mo masabi na talagang pinapatay na lang yan. Nagkakaroon talaga ng pukpukan na, ng gira yan.
So sinasabi niyo po na talagang magkakapukpukan, na magkakaroon ng violence.
As much as possible, sino bang gusto ng patayan? Ang pulis tao rin yan. We value life. We value life. Ang pulis, ayaw rin niya makapatay ng tao. Ako, sabihin ko sa'yo, maraming beses ako nakapatay ng tao, legal na paraan, barilan. Pero kahit ilang beses ka na napasabak sa enkwentro, nandiyon pa rin sa utak mo yan, yung trauma na hindi dapat patayin yung tao. Dahil ako, after makapatay ako ng tao, pupunta ko sa simbahan, humingi ng awa, nagpang-awa ko sa Diyos na sana, Lord, patawarin mo ako dahil hindi ko dapat gawin yun. Traumatic yan sa pulis, akala mo, trigger happy lang pulis, baril lang baril. Hindi po yan mangyari, tao rin yung pulis, isipin ninyo.
General, may tanong lang po ako tungkol doon sa yung pyramid na binabanggit nyo, no? Yung struktura ng yung ecosystem at saka yung distribution network ng mga droga. Tama po yung sinabi nyo. Karamihan, yung mga pusher, yung mga dealer dito sa street level, marami yan. No? Sinabi nyo nga sa pinakantuktok, paano po yun? When it comes to the death penalty, as you said, yung pinakatuktok, kailangan din matakot. Paano kung yung taga-tuktok nasa China? Just like you said, na yung mga manufacturers nasa labas, yung malalaking sindikato nasa labas, kaya nga po nasabi niyo, Dela pa rin ang dating sa atin nun, di ba? I mean, at the end of the day, you impose the death penalty. Hindi po ba yung maliliit lang din sa babang maiiwan, samantalang yung mga malalakas at yung mga malalaking big-time drug lord, pati na all the way to China, precisely that, they're out of the reach of the law.
Well, kung hindi natin kayang maabot yung nandoon sa China na nagpapadala, yung pinapadalhan dito, marami rin, kagaya lang nahuli natin na nasa mga bilibid na ngayon, nasa BGMP nakakulong, marami pa rin ganyan, big time pa rin yan. So kung ma-eliminate natin yung dito na within our jurisdiction, ma-eliminate natin itong portion na ito, sinong papapadalhan pa ng mga Chinese drug lord na nakabase sa China? Sinong tatanggap dito? Kung na-neutralize natin itong mga drug lord dito na taga-tanggap dito at taga-distribute.
Okay. So, malinaw po yung urgency doon sa mensahe, no? Naintindihan naman ng mga tao 'yun. But yun yung tanong ko sa debate sa death penalty, because on the one hand we're saying, look, the war on drugs is winning. Nakikita natin yung resulta and so on. We get conflicting statements, but at the end of the day, pagka tinanong ang gobyerno, successful po ba? Sinasabi, successful. And yet isn't the campaign for the death penalty premised on the argument na we are failing? Kasi yan po ang naririnig natin sa mga proponents. Hindi kami makalaban kasi walang death penalty. Because tumataas, dumadami pa rin ng distributor. Hindi namin kayang habulin yung mga warlord. Hindi namin mahuli. Isn't the whole argument for the death penalty basically premised on an admission that the war on drugs has been failing?
Well, hindi mo masabi na ganon. Gusto natin, depende sa standard mo yan gusto mo magkaya na mawala yung droga dito, totally zero. So, gagawa tayo ng mga measures na towards that. Pero pag sinabi mo na, porque walang death penalty, failure ang drug war natin. No, hindi failure. We are striving to hit the top. So kung gusto mo hit ang top, kailangan natin ng mga legislative measures na mag-support para doon sa effort na yan.
No, General, linawin ko lang po. This is not me saying it. This is me trying to clarify precisely kung ano yung naririnig ko sa mga proponents. Because yung argument po na yun, nanggagaling doon sa mga nagtutulak ng death penalty for drugs. They are the ones saying na hindi namin kayang lumaban.
Hindi, ganito, Robbie, I am the... isa ako sa author ng death penalty sa Senado. Sinasabi ko, mas magiging effective tayo, mas magiging successful tayo kapag mayroong death penalty. So hindi ko sinasabi na failure tayo dahil walang death penalty. Yun na. Mas successful
Pero,
maging
Senator Bato,
successful tayo, yung success rate natin ay tataas kung meron tayong death penalty.
but Mr. Senator, have we successfully cleansed the ranks sufficiently already for us to be able to rely on a death penalty law? Kasi yun ang premise natin noong umpisa na sana nga nalinis natin na maigi yung rango muna bago tayo naglunsad ng drug war. Ngayon, kung magpapasok tayo ng death penalty law, sapat na ba yung paglilinis ng rango para ipasok ang death penalty?
Non-stop po ang effort. Nagsusumika po ang liderato ng PNP na malinis talaga yan. Ang kanilang ranks. Ongoing yan. Hindi pwedeng mag-stop yan. Kung sabihin mong sapat, para sa akin, as of now, kung wala ka nakikitang pang-abuso dyan sa mga anti-drug operatives, sapat na yan. Pero huwag tayong huminto dyan. As I've said, very attractive yung, very tempting yung drug operations, very tempting yan na magagawa ka ng kalokohan. So dapat tuloy-tuloy. Tuloy-tuloy yan. Sa ngayon, kung wala ka nakikita, okay na sa akin. Kung wala nag-abuso, okay.
In the meantime, Senator, paano nyo ho kaya mabubura ang perception na grabe nga po ang nalabag na human rights, no? Lalo't ngayon ay may resolution nga sa UN na dapat imbestigahan na nga dahil napakarami na sa kanilang bilang 27,000. Malayong-malayo sa bilang ng PNP na 5,500. Pero ganun pa man, may perception globally na grabe nga ang human rights violations. How do you dispel that perception if indeed it's merely a perception?
Gusto mo mawala yung perception na yan? We stop the war on drugs. Hinto natin ito. Pabayaan yung mga addict na yan. Pabayaan yung mga puser na yan. Continue kayo sa inyong negosyo. Ganun. Mawala na yung perception ng pabayaan natin. Sige. Ayaw ninyo mag-conduct ng war on drugs. Sige, pabayaan natin.
General,
Kasi yung mga allegation na yan, kung hindi yan politically motivated, kung talagang fair at saka honest yung kanilang mga basis, walang problema. Pero pag sinabi mo, 27,000? My God! Ikaw naniniwala ka ba? Matagal ka na dyan sa media. Maniwala ka ba 27,000 ang namatay sa war on drugs?
Pero
General, sabi niyo nga po, one way to rid the perception, itigil ang war on drugs. I see your point there. But, Sir General, how about another option? What about the option being proposed by the human rights advocates to just allow an independent investigation into the country? That's a good option. That's a sincere suggestion na one way para magkalinawan, why not allow an independent probe into the matter?
Ako, Robby, wala akong problema. Kasi wala tayong tinatago. They can come anytime kung gusto nila. Pwede lang ibisigan. Para makita nila, to see for themselves kung totoo yung sinasabi na mga tarantado nating kababayan na nagbibigay sa kanila ng report na 27,000 at yung ating justice system is not working at ito daw mga sinasabi lang EJK is state sponsored. Sige, para malaman nila. Punta sila dito.
Pero si Pangulo Duterte yata, Senator, ang may ayaw no? At hindi ang kanyang reaction pa nga ay putulin ang anumang assistance na binibigay ng mga bansa na pumirma sa resolusyon ng Iceland na imbestigahan nga tayo. So, paano po yun? Hindi nyo ba pwede?
Minsan na po siya nagbanta. Nagbanta siya sa mga investigador na papasok dito dati.
Well, alam mo, Lutzi, that's understandable on the part of the President. Dahil he is the head of state. Parang sinampal siya sa mukha niyan pag ganun ang gagawin ng mga tao na yan. Para bang totoo talaga na our justice system here in the Philippines is not working at yung mga pagpatay na yan ay talagang state sponsored. Para sampal sa kanya yan eh. Kaya natouch yung pride ng tao. Kaya bakit? Sino kayo na makialam dito sa bansa ko? Unahin nyo muna problema nyo sa bansa nyo bago kayo makialam dito sa amin. At we are perfectly fine here. Wala kayong problema.
Pero sir,
Kung nakikita
sir,
yung
also,
problema ito, sa amin hindi
Opo.
problema ito.
pero sir, it also does not help that the president himself, pag magbitawan ng salitang Pangulo, minsan sasabihin niya, papakain ko yung mga patay sa Manila Bay o maliligo kayo ng dugo. O kaya, ilalabas ko, ako mismo nakahuli sa mga yan, ilalabas ko yan sa likod at ako babarilin ko sila mismo. It does not help when the president says that publicly in his speeches.
Well, alam mo, this is Philippines. Pilipinas ito, Ed. Sige nga, mag-presidente ka dyan na pabayot-bayot, pabakla-bakla na walang dating, walang bayag. Kung paniwalaan ka ng mga tarantado sa Pilipinas, no. Hindi ka paniwalaan dyan. Lahat na sinasabi ni Presidente ay hyperbole. Lahat na sinasabi niya ay puro yan mga just to give the emphasis na gusto talaga niya na mawala ang kriminalidad at droga sa Pilipinas. Parang ako mismo, nung chief PNP ako, pagkaharap ko yung camera, I'm trying to be tough. Sabihin ko na ganun. Pero deep inside, yung puso ko malambot ito.
General,
I don't think magkakaroon ng external investigation dito hanggat nakaupo si Presidente. In the meantime, pasok pa rin yung karami-rami pa rin drogang pumapasok Mukhang hindi natatakot yung iba. Ano yung sa tingin yung pwede pang gawin? Nakukulangan pa ba kayo dun sa campaign? Ano yung pwedeng gawin? Apart from all these encounters with all these violent encounters, may nakukulangan pa ba kayo? Halimbawa sa customs o sa airport, ano pang gusto nyong makita dito sa war on drugs?
Yung death penalty. Balik natin yung death penalty dyan sa drug trafficking. Para sino tatanggap dito ng ganyong kalaking quantity ng droga? Kung meron tayong death penalty sa drug trafficking, that is trafficking. Kaya kung walang death penalty, tuloy-tuloy pa rin papasok. Pero ito mind you, sabihan lang kita na nagpasalamat tayo na may marami tayong nahuhuli ngayon. Ibig sabihin, yung ating kapulisan, yung ating PDEA ay nagtatrabaho. Kasi kung walang nahuhuli, akala mo walang problema. Pero mayroon palang nakakalusot. Ngayon na may nahuli, pasalamat tayo sa ating kapulisan na nagtatrabaho sila. Marami silang nahuli.
Hindi ba kayo
General, if you don't mind, papalik pa lang po yung...
Hindi ba kayo naghahanap ng reform sa judiciary? Kasi yan ang sinasabi ni Presidente. Kaya daw kailangan ng ng mga ganitong klaseng methodology kasi mahina daw yung justice system natin. Hindi ba kayo magpupush ng gano'n na judicial reforms para mas madaling mahabol yung mga drug traffickers na hindi kailangan ng too much violence siguro?
Tatargetin natin yan, yung judicial reform na yan. Kasi ito nga, nakakadismaya. Ito lang, bago lang lumabas yung desisyon ng korte sa Manila ba yun? Na si Kerwin Espinosa, absuelto na naman sa kanyang drug cases. Saan ka makahanap ng ganyang sitwasyon? Kahirap tanggapin. Nagpapakamatay yung mga pulis dyan para sa trabaho na yan. Pagdating doon sa korte, dismiss na naman ang kaso. Kerwin Espinosa, napakalaking drug lord yan, wala. Hindi na exonerated siya sa kaso niya. Konbiktado siya sa kanyang illegal possession of firearms lang. Pero yung drug case niya, kawawa ang pulis natin, umiiyak sa sama ng loob. Bakit ganoon?
General, balikan ko lang po yung panawagan for an international probe into the war on drugs to look specifically at the implications and impacts on EJKs and human rights and so on. We hear what you're saying. Galit na galit ang Presidente because part of his job is also to watch for the sovereignty of the country. Kaya po sinasabi niyo, naiintindihan niyo pagka nagmumura. But dadagdagan ko lang yung sinabi ni Ed, it's not just the President, it's this whole atmosphere na kung sino man magtanong, nadidemonize. Kayo po mismo. Sabi niyo, yung mga nagpunta dyan sa UN at umangal, mga tarantado yan, hindi niyan mahal ng bayan, sinisiraan lang, and so on. But let me respond as well to what you said. No? Yung sinabi niya, naniniwala ka ba doon na 26,000? Ito po, honest, feeling ko. Ang typical Filipino, siguro iniisip niya, maaaring hindi ako maniwala na ganun karami 26,000. Siguro meron dyan murder, meron dyan siguro common crime. Pero meron din Pilipino, sasabihin din nila, pero hindi rin ako naniniwala 5,500 lang. Parang napakababa. And precisely because hindi natin alam and ang assumption ng tao, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Isn't that
Well,
precisely the biggest argument for letting an independent body come in and then be a reliable independent arbiter between these two sides? Because even if we just to assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle.
well, as I have said, wala tayong tinatago. Pwede sila mag-imbestiga kung gugustuhin nila. Tingnan mo, katagal na sila nag-ngak-ngak dyan ng investigasyon. Anong resulta na pakita nila? Kahit na itong local natin na mga human rights sa mga kwan dito, mga bleeding hearts. Anong resulta? Na-approve ba nila na 27,000? Wala pa rin sila masasabi na 27,000. Dahil nga, ginawa lang nila yung mga numbers na yan para to prop up the sentiments, anti-government sentiments ng ating mga kababayan at ng mga tao doon sa abroad. Wala. Kung ganito kasi, the official records ng PNP, alam mo kung gusto mag-doktor ng PNP, ng records, bakit gawin lang 6,000? Pwede ba lang gawin 3,000 o kaya 1,000? Bakit 6,000? Because that is the true records, true and official records. Now, ikaw, kung ayaw mo maniwala sa record ng PNP, abolish natin ang PNP. Paputahin natin yung nagbigay ng data na yan, sila ang gawin natin itong law enforcement agency sa ating bansa.
General Senator, if you remember, we had this conversation for our podcast before. We talked precisely about this. We also spoke to PDEA's Derek Carion. And one of the things that we talked about is, isang problema sa data is the definition of what gets counted within that 5,500. Napaka-narrow ng definition. Hindi lang yung basta-bastang police operation. Kailangan, halimbawa, pag kailangan police operation at yung namatay mismo na target and so on. Pagka may tinamaan outside the house na collateral damage, hindi pa yun counted doon sa 5,500. That much I appreciate from our conversation we had with you and also with the PDEA spokesman Derek Carion. The definition is so small, it does not allow for to even consider collateral damage and other people who were killed just because they were not part of official police operations.
Well, I don't know kung ano na standard nila ngayon sa pagbilang. Basta sa panahon ko, lahat ng namatay during drug operations, kung man yan, sila ba ang target or collateral damage, basta mayroong nangyaring napatay, kasama yan sa bilang. Hindi yan tinatanggal sa bilang. Kasama po yan. Result of a drug operation. As a result of that drug operation, may namatay na bystander, kasama yan sa pag-record. Hindi yan pwedeng ihiwalay mo. Ewan ko kung paanong standard ng PDEA, pero sa panahon ko when I was chief PNP, kasama yan sa recording.
Okay, so talagang hindi na natin mariresolve yung difference ninyo ng mga human rights groups, no, at pati na yung UN human rights. So
dahil hindi talaga ma-resolve yan.
Hituan na po ito siguro.
Sir, if I may, sir, let me just rephrase the question po. Sa inyo pong pananaw at sa inyo pong pagkakaalam, meron bang ibang mga pinatay na sabihin natin drug lords or drug suspects ng mga vigilantes o ng mga sabihin natin outside of the ambit of the law, outside of normal police operations?
Di ba may nakita tayo na pinatay na nakalagay dito sa dibdib na kuwan ako, pusir ako, huwag tularan. Sino pumatay noon?
Okay.
Okay.
Hindi kasama sa police operation yon. So that's
Hindi nila sinasama yun.
Talagang never the twain shall meet ito. Okay. Okay.
But just to follow that up, sa inyo pong, huli na lang, si General Bato, huli na lang po. If it's okay with you po, huli na lang po. Sa inyo pananaw, kung meron ng mga ganong karatula na huwag tularan, sa tingin po ba ninyo ito'y na-encourage ng drug war?
Well, maraming taong galit sa droga. Maraming taong frustrated na sa sitwasyon. Kaya hindi natin sila masisi na they take matters into their own hands. Pag gano'n na frustrated yung tao, lalo na siguro yung napatayan yung na-rape ang anak at pinatay ng adik, yung mga call center agents na pag-uwi sa gabi, ninakawan na, hinold up na, nirape na, pinatay pa, sinunog pa. So hindi mo maiwasan ang tao na maging frustrated. Magagalit talaga dyan sa mga involved sa droga.
Okay.
Okay.
Oo.
Okay. Well, maraming salamat, Senator Bato de la Rosa. Sir, thank you for joining us tonight.
Salamat sa inyo.
Sumigwi lang kayo sa wag po mamaya.
Oo, pwede.
Sabihin nyo kay Lord, ha?
Sige. Hindi ako galit sa inyo, ha? Baka mamaya sabihin nyo, nagalit ako. Yun lang ako magsalita.
Hindi po.
Talaga ako magsalita.
Kilala ka na namin, sir.
Salamat, Lucy. Salamat.
Yan po.
Salamat po. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just pause for a break, so please stay with us.
Welcome back to the Chiefs. We are now in the final stage of our conversation. And now joining us from Geneva is Laila Matar, Human Rights Watch Deputy Director for the United Nations. Good evening, Ms. Matar. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Good evening.
Yes. Okay, Ms. Matar, Human Rights Watch has described the situation in the Philippines. You've said that there is still widespread and systematic killings related to the war on drugs in the Philippines. How much really can the United Nations do? How far can you go in investigating this, considering that our president simply refuses to let in anyone, no external investigation? It's a violation of the state sovereignty. How far can the UN go?
The UN, remarkably, without being able to have access to the Philippines in June, already produced an extremely authoritative report, which confirmed what Human Rights Watch and other organizations have been saying for years. So they found that indeed the killings have a widespread and systematic character, that among those thousands killed, 208 human rights defenders, journalists, and unionists were killed and silenced, and that children were among those that have been killed. And importantly, what they said is that they found that barriers to accessing justice in the country are almost insurmountable. So even without that access, just in producing one report, they were able to produce a very authoritative overview that paints a very dark picture of the human rights situation in the Philippines.
But what can you do with that report? If you have that report, what can the UN do?
So, it's very clear that when you have a report like that on the table, the responsibility of the UN human rights body of the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council, it is their duty and responsibility to live up to their mandate now and launch an independent international investigation into the killings and the other violations. That kind of investigation would be able to go much deeper, documenting the facts and circumstances of the violations, preserving the evidence, which could later feed into international accountability. options. That's what they can do, and that's what we and 60 organizations from all around the world, including many working in the Philippines, believe that they should do while they're in session right now.
Ms. Matar, if you could give us an idea there. I mean, as Abby pointed out, the president has already said this. We just had Senator Bato de la Rosa as our guest. I think it's safe to say it's not going to happen in terms of an independent body coming into the Philippines. But short of having independent investigators coming into the Philippines, what might an international investigation look like and be able to carry out outside of Philippine soil?
Right, that's a good question. There's many circumstances around the world where the worst violators of human rights refuse to give access to independent investigators because they're afraid of what information will come out and be proven. And we've seen time and again that the tools available to the UN Human Rights Council, mandating the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to do investigations, that they can actually do very robust investigations even without access to the country. So we've seen that in countries like Syria, for example, authoritative report after report that has been hugely valuable, even though they didn't have access to the country. Now, I'm not saying that's ideal. What we hope the Philippines would do is be a responsible member of the international community, set their mind towards change, and begin to open up for independent investigators. But if we don't see the political will for that, there are still ways to do those investigations from outside the country.
Yes,
But
we're
Ms. Laila,
wondering what
please run us
sources
through
you would
how.
probably use for this. Especially if the government itself is barring you from coming in and you're saying that there are ways and means to do this. What sources do you usually go to? Is it the human rights groups within the country? Is it human rights groups outside of the country? And what documents will you use? And how are you going to ensure that these are valid documents?
I will not speak for the UN, which is independent and has their own methodologies and robust ability to do these kind of investigations in a legitimate and credible way. And I know that they verify their own information. Of course, those at the forefront of documenting the violations, the groups in the Philippines, I know for many organizations of the world have been absolutely critical in order to get the word out about what's happening, about the killings that are happening on the streets every single day.
Okay, and if you find that there is a ground for actual punitive action, what would those punitive actions be? Are they going to take the form of sanctions, perhaps? I just wonder.
Right. I mean, that's for individual governments to decide, right, whether they apply sanctions. But what I think is a very important first step is that the international community comes together at that body of the UN that is meant to be there to uphold human rights and says clearly enough is enough. We cannot treat the situation in the Philippines as business as usual, and build on the work they did mandating that report last year by launching an investigation now. And, one thing is sort of future accountability down the line, but the reason this is so pressing now is if you look at the domestic review panel that the government surprised the world by announcing in June, we believe that the structures of that mechanism does not hold. Those agencies and individuals implicated in the killings are among those that review those cases, which then have to go through the Department of Justice, Interior, and others, which themselves are implicated. So in a context like that, where the domestic accountability review panel that's set up is inadequate, clearly is a way to avoid international accountability, where in all other cases, as you've discussed earlier on the show, there's only been one single prosecution. That is exactly when the international community needs to step up and say enough is enough. We will launch independent investigations.
Now, it's clear what you think of the DOJ panel, but let me just try to be constructive about it. I mean, I understand, and I think it's a legitimate criticism. This cannot be impartial if it's led by the DOJ and by government agencies. But given that, what would you accept or might you be open to make that a more credible panel or a more credible process? Is there a possibility, or are you saying that absolutely no, there's no way that, because you're already saying, look, the Commission on Human Rights is going to be part of that panel and it's not required, but we have the option to invite Philippine civil society and human rights groups into that panel as well, or at least on certain processes. What else might you welcome or be open to even consider giving the DOJ the benefit of the doubt on that panel?
Listen, I think actually the answer to your question lies very much in what the High Commissioner for Human Rights herself said on Monday. She said, okay, there is this review panel, we'll look into that. But meanwhile, what is needed is a reversal of policies, right? So what would give much more credibility to any domestic process is if the incitement to killings at the highest level stopped, if the killings of drug suspects actually ended, if there was a reversal in policies, then we can begin to see some weight or credibility behind domestic processes. Another thing that would have to end for this to be credible is the intimidation and attacks on civil society and victims. You know, we know from people we've spoken to on the ground that they're too afraid to file cases, not only because the barriers are high and tall, but because they're afraid of retaliation by the government, the police, and others. So, you know, all those trends, the killings, the violence, the attacks, that needs to stop. And at that point, I think the international community will be able to take something like this review panel with more than just a pinch of salt.
Ms. Laila, I'd like to ask how exactly, a bit more detail, how investigations could be done from outside the country. I think it was mentioned that you could possibly be looking at, or they could possibly be looking at civil service organizations and human rights groups. But on the other hand, from the point of view of this government, they've already been labeled as not being impartial by this government and not being objective. So from the get-go, it's going to be a problem.
Right, and that's the sort of hypocritical dilemma that the government puts us in. On the one hand, they're saying these sources are not credible. And on the other hand, they're saying you cannot come into the country to verify yourself. And so they need to choose. They can't have it both ways. I think the UN, and again, I will not speak for them, relies on a multitude of sources that they independently verify. You'd have to speak to them about that. But I think we've seen time and time again that the truth has come out that way. But if the government is not comfortable with any or some of those sources, well, then open up. If you have nothing to hide, stand by your policies, open up, let the UN in, let other investigators in, and then we can see those facts speak for themselves.
Yeah, let me ask about the dilemma that you're creating for government as well, if I may, because on the one hand you're saying, look, we might, there's a small chance we might give that DOJ panel more than a pinch of salt. But you say, but wait, stop the policy first, reverse the policy first. And I can see government saying, hold on, why is that a dependency? If the task of the panel is to look at alleged past crimes and alleged past human rights violations, why do we have to reverse our policy and so on when a DOJ panel conceptually and on a conceptual level might be credible, given some tweets and some representation from civil society, human rights groups, international NGOs, maybe, I don't know, maybe even the UN. Let me just say, why is that a dependency? Why do you have to put government in that position that reverse all policy first, and then we can talk about giving that panel, as you said, more than a pinch of salt?
Yeah, listen, there's governments around the world that on paper have really robust mechanisms, even great laws, and that still violate the rights of their citizens. This is a phenomenon that's not unique to the Philippines. The problem with this review panel is it's neither credible on paper. Again, as we said, internally, the structures don't make sense from the perspective of impartiality. The moment at which they announced it was very conspicuous during a debate on the Philippines in June at the UN. And it's very difficult for us then to see it as anything but just the latest trick in a bag of tricks that the Philippines constantly uses to try to deceive the international community. I think it's extremely difficult from a human rights perspective to say, we're going to take something which, first of all, doesn't look good on paper, but even if it did, take it seriously when the precise things you're meant to be investigating are continuing to happen and continuing to be encouraged by the president himself. So I think you cannot separate the context from what's on paper. And as I said, even on paper, it does not look good.
Is there a precedent for this kind of investigation in relation to the war on drugs? Because the Philippines is not the only country that has been engaged in a really violent war on drugs. We have all these Latin American countries, in Mexico, in Colombia, and outside in Asia, we had Thailand. They killed also thousands of people. Are you operating on some kind of template, or are you just going about this a first time? Is it a first time for Human Rights Watch?
No, Human Rights Watch investigates violations in many countries around the world, more than 90, and this is not unique to the Philippines. But this is also a line that the government likes to use, not only to take attention away from itself, but to discourage countries that also have drug-related problems from targeting them. The matter of the fact is we have to look at each situation in its individual context. In the Philippines, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has found that at least there is those 8,600 killings, and that the real number could be up to triple that number. That is absolutely staggering. The killing of 208 human rights defenders, you do not see that every day. So we have to look at this particular issue at its merits. And instead of looking at the worst other perpetrators in the world, let's look at the many other countries that have taken a health-based approach to tackling illegal drugs.
So this is a proposal that the proposal that the drug problem be approached from a health perspective. This is one of the suggestions for states.
That's right. And I mean, that doesn't mean that the police and the legal system doesn't have a role to play. Of course it does, and it often does. But the question is, do you have to violate the rights of your citizens and kill people en masse? And that's where the answer is no. And that's where the Philippines should not get away scot-free with a policy that's been ongoing since 2016 and has devastated the livelihoods and lives of so many families.
Yeah, I want to get back to the original question about, how much can we expect out of this process? I think we all want to be optimistic about the human rights process and the international human rights community bringing its moral suasion to bear down beyond what politics can do. But I mentioned Thailand. You take an example of Thaksin Shinawatra, and he had a war on drugs. Thousands were killed there. At that time, we thought those were high numbers. But Thaksin is exiled now, not because of human rights. He's not exiled because of the number of people killed. In other words, you take that example, and he's not actually been taken into account. He's not being made accountable for that war on drugs, which preceded the war on drugs here in the Philippines. So I go back to my original question. How optimistic can we be? Not that we're looking for any particular resolution or any particular outcome here, but how optimistic can people be on the process of international communities trying to bring accountability on questions of human rights on a national level, and then taking it to an internationalizing a resolution to it?
There's really, in my view, never one solution to a complex problem like that. The Human Rights Council mandating another report or an investigation will not solve the murderous anti-drug campaign. It won't end it. But if Duterte and his administration did not care about what the international community is saying and what the Human Rights Council is saying, then they would not have launched such a massive misinformation campaign and this diplomatic approach all over the world to target diplomats and deter them from taking action on the Philippines. So clearly they care. And that is a proof of concept for why it is important to send strong messages from human rights bodies that enough is enough, that the world is watching. And if I may, one more thing, that the challenge with this type of international action and investigations is you never know what would have happened if they were not there. How much worse could it be? Is it deterring the worst violations? And that's where we're saying it's absolutely critical that they do launch an investigation to play their role as the UN Human Rights Council to speak up for victims in the Philippines.
I'm just curious, what was the reaction of the Human Rights Watch to the initial reaction of President Duterte to actually cut off financial assistance being offered to the Philippines by those countries that voted to investigate the Philippines on its human rights record?
Yes, that's a good question. And, really our reaction goes in line with what I was saying earlier. That was one more attack against anyone who dares criticize the Philippines, right? So you've seen obviously the attacks on civil society on the ground, whether it be killings, shutting of media networks or otherwise. But then you've also seen that when UN experts dare to criticize the war on drugs, they too have been threatened, attacked, and otherwise harassed. So basically, when the European countries then finally did stand in support of a resolution that would address the war on drugs, it's no surprise that the Duterte administration would say they would reject those funds, though my understanding is in the end they did not.
Could you cite an
Laila
example of any case where an investigation of a similar something similar resulted in positive in reforms in a particular country in the way they waged the war on drugs? What's the record in these cases?
I don't think the Human Rights Council context in which I operate has had a situation similar to the Philippines, but we have extensive experience working with other governments where you do a combination of the technical assistance and capacity building that the government of the Philippines claims that it wants, but at the same time, the robust monitoring and reporting to be able to inform that assistance so that over time the situation can change. And frankly, accountability is a long game. Very often, you don't see it in the short term. It might take time, and that's precisely why it's so important to gather the evidence and retain it now.
All right.
Okay, Ms. Laila Matar, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Do we go?
Maganda sanang pagsalitain, magpagdebatihin silang dalawa ni Senator Bato. Sarap pakinggan nun, diba? Sasabihin niya, come over here, take a look for yourself.
Yes.
Pag si Senator Bato yun, talagang iyayain niya yun.
I-invite niya. Ewan lang natin pagdating sa Malacanang. Okay.
Okay, that's it for this Thursday edition of the Chiefs. We're over the hump, so we're going into a weekend. I'm at Lingao. I forgot.
I'm Ani Paminton of the Philippine Star.
I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Ravi Alapay. We are One News.